It's in the essential nature of the teachings of yoga to revolutionize and transform every culture, every system of belief that they come in contact with. And it's happening right now, largely due to the presence of Sri Swami Satchidananda. It's been going on for a little over 50 years in this country. What you may not realize is that this has actually been happening for quite some time. Now, within this satsang series, just a few months ago, you had a presentation on the history of yoga by Reverend Dr. Cunningham. And so rather than cover that material again, I'd like to confine my remarks to presenting some of the early evidence for these revolutionary points of contact. Something like what we recognize as yoga philosophy, at least in written form, as it survives today, begins to emerge in the earliest of the Upanishads in the first millennium before Christ. What we see emerge there is what is often now known as the Sankhya philosophy, which forms the underpinnings of the teachings of the Yoga Sutras. But we have to wait for a definition of the term yoga until the Katha Upanishad, which comes slightly later. And in there we learn, as you can see in the Sanskrit definition here, that yoga is to be considered concentration on the steadiness of the senses, which is not the same definition that is presented in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali that are studied here. But I wouldn't say it's a bad start. Shortly after that, a long period begins in which the epic poem, the Mahabharata, begins to take shape. This is the poem within which the Bhagavad Gita takes place. And of course, the Gita talks about yoga. There is actually another treatise within the Mahabharata, which is a very, very close rendering of the Yoga Sutras. It's not studied here, but it's of a great deal of historical importance because it's not really clear which of the two came first, because it's almost certain that one of them knew about the other. In any case, no later than 150 BCE, Bhagavan Patanjali himself comes along. He's primarily known in academic circles as a grammarian, actually, and it's because of his work on grammar that we're able to set this date of 150. Whether he in fact contributed to the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is a matter of some debate in academic circles, but I and a few others believe that he did contribute at least the portion between the early sutras of Book 2 and the early sutras of Book 3, which happens to include the presentation of Ashtanga Yoga, the 8 limbs of yoga, the central practice. In any case, within 200 years of Patanjali's life, yoga has turned into a kind of pan-Indic religious movement, which has made an impact already on the other religions of India. And the first evidence that I know of for this is a poem called the Buddha Charita, which appears in the 1st century of the Christian era. Within the Buddha Charita, we come across this figure named Arada sitting on the left. This, by the way, comes from a Japanese animated cartoon. He's still very much a part of the story of the Buddha's life that is taught to children in Japan. So in Japan, he's called Alara Kalama, I think. But the Buddha Charita refers to him as Arada. In any case, Arada is a Sankhya philosopher who is the Buddha's first guru. And within the Buddha Charita, we see a lengthy and very coherent exposition on Sankhya philosophy that very closely follows the Yoga Sutras. So Lord Buddha studied yoga. Now, at the end of this chapter of the Buddhacharita. Lord Buddha says, "Thank you very much, revered teacher. These are very wise teachings, but I take exception to some of them, and so I'm going to go off and start my own religion." And the specific point that he takes exception to is that the Yoga Sutra postulates that the Purusha, after attaining enlightenment, remains for eternity. It continues to exist. And Lord Buddha says that you wouldn't really be able to say that you had attained emancipation unless the soul was completely annihilated and ceased to exist. This is actually a fairly mainstream consensus, I guess you could say, within Madhyamaka Buddhist philosophy. It also exists within other classical schools of Hindu philosophy, by the way, but it's not a part of yoga, it's not a part of Sankhya. And so they agree to disagree. Now, this is going to be important because Buddhism is going to keep developing yoga on its own, separate from the tradition that the Yoga Sutras represent. So, around the 2nd century CE, the Orthodox schools of Hinduism begin to take shape, and yoga is one of them. Probably many of you have heard of these. Vedanta is another one, Sankhya is another one. There are 6 of them in total. And there are a number of wildly popular debates that people attend between scholars of these various schools between the 2nd century and the 5th century of the Common Era. And at the end, they put together darshana texts, they're called. Texts that systematize their philosophy, present their terminology, and present the means of right knowledge. Those of you who have studied the Yoga Sutras know that there's a particular section on that towards the beginning of the book. So the Yoga Sutras are one of those darshana texts. They become the classical apparatus for studying yoga for at least the next 700 years. So what happened between Patanjali's original contribution and the Yoga Sutras is very interesting. I don't have time to go into it all this evening. But essentially, it looks as though the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, as we have them, became a kind of rehabilitation manual for Buddhists. If you lost one of these debates and you wound up having to be converted over to Sankhya or yoga philosophy, this would help you get started. And in fact, there is a large amount of Buddhist terminology that occurs within the Yoga Sutra on the causes of suffering, the escape from suffering, the means of escape from suffering that very closely echo the 4 noble truths within Buddhism. Now, this is where Buddhism starts to pay back some of the interest they owe. In the 8th century CE, we see the first mention of the term Hatha Yoga, the kind of yoga that many of us here practice. And Hatha Yoga is, the interesting thing about this is that it first appears in the Buddhist canon, actually not in a Hindu source, not in anything specifically associated with the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And Hatha Yoga is the kind of yoga you practice if you're just not getting the result you want within the time frame you were expecting, and you need to kind of accelerate your practice a little bit with physical asanas. And so this begins to take shape within a tradition that accommodates the Yoga Sutras as well. That appears classically in this 11th century work called the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra. This is the same Dattatreya of the Nath yogis like Goraknath and Matsendranath that you may have heard of. There's a pose taught here called the half-spinal twist, which in Sanskrit is Matsyendrasana. That's named for him. So Dattatreya is this work, rather, the Yoga Shastra, is in that lineage. They incorporate what they call Raja Yoga, which seems to refer to the Yoga Sutras, as well as some other meditation practices, and a special yoga called Laya Yoga, in which the Kundalini and the chakras and this kind of occult sciences first seems to appear within yoga literature. What you may not know is that around this same time, another book appears, and it appears in Arabic, written by a guy named Al-Biruni. By this time, the Islamic invasions have taken place in northern India, and the Arabs have discovered the Yoga Sutras, and they are fascinated by it. In 1973, the USSR was equally impressed with Al-Biruni enough to issue a 6-cent postage stamp in his honor. Here he is. In any case, Al-Biruni, it's some matter of dispute exactly how widely circulated his Arabic summary of the Yoga Sutras was. That might be because it was very uncritical. He says near the beginning something to the effect that I could try to recapitulate the exception that I take to this based on Islamic philosophy, but I'd probably get it wrong anyway, and so I'll just present the Yoga Sutras as best I can. And out he comes with a fairly accurate rendering of the yoga philosophy. So not only that, but by the 13th century, another manuscript tradition begins, which in academic circles is called the Pool of Nectar. This is actually based on a collection of Sanskrit and Hindi manuscripts mixed with a very healthy dose of Christian Gnosticism and Greek philosophy. It is a truly eclectic kind of trade manual approach to yoga. The Yoga Sutras were probably a part of that, but these go well beyond the scope of the Yoga Sutras and include physical poses from the Hatha Yoga tradition, and they teach many other things that you would recognize today as part of yoga, such as fasting, vegetarian diet, and an extensive discourse on the value of pranayama. This appears first in Persian. It's illustrated, by the way. They're very pretty. This fellow, I don't know what these hand gestures mean, but he's practicing yoga. He's sitting in his meditative pose with his book, and there's either a musical instrument or some kind of water pot there. In other renderings of this gentleman practicing the teachings of this book outside his hut, he also has a small cat. Thus, Cat Yoga is born. And it gets even more interesting because it doesn't remain in Persian. It's translated into Arabic. And from Arabic, it travels to Yemen, where it meets with Jewish traders. So there has been an interest in the Jewish community in yoga for at least 500 years. And this is an example of it. This, by the way, is not Hebrew. This is called Judeo-Arabic. So these traders were versatile in spoken Arabic, but could not read written Arabic. And so they used the Hebrew alphabet to write Arabic. So that's what this is. And you can see that some pages of this manuscript are illustrated. This particular illustration here is my favorite. The text here is instructing the practitioner to cross his eyes and focus on his nose. And that apparently that required a demonstration. So around the same time, we also see the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which probably all of you are familiar with, as well as something else called the Dharma Patanjala. The Dharma Patanjala is now on the other side of India. It's an Indo-Javanese text found in modern-day, I don't want to say the country, I'm not sure, but it's in Southeast Asia. In any case, it's a presentation of Shaiva Siddhanta philosophy mainly, but about a third of the book is a reversification of the first 3 books of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. There's somewhat of a question as to whether the Patanjala in the title is in fact refers to Patanjali. Nevertheless, he's obviously very taken with the man, enough to essentially try to gloss 3/4 of the book into this book. Regrettably, I don't have a picture of that manuscript. In any case, all this happens by the 15th century. And this tradition then more or less comes to maturity in the 16th century. I've put one more work here. This actually originates in India, in the south, called the Yoga Sudhakara. This represents probably one of the last, if not the last, commentary on the Yoga Sutra before the arrival of Western colonists, which is important because it demonstrates the development of an indigenous tradition of learning and scholarship around the Yoga Sutras that was not influenced by the English interest in the Yoga Sutras, which was profound. So the Yoga Sudhakara gives a very clear exposition on what it believes are three levels of practice that exist within the Yoga Sutras. This isn't something that's widely taught here or anywhere else. It's a rather unconventional interpretation of the Yoga Sutras. But more importantly, this Swamiji who wrote it is a member of one of the southern Vedantic mutts that is affiliated with the teachings of Adi Shankaracharya. And the Dashanama sannyasis, the Swamis who live at this ashram, are descendants of this same lineage from southern India. So this is actually a rather crucial time. It's the time during which the Vijayanagar dynasty is collapsing, and they were patrons of these mutts, and it's also just before the English arrive. And it represents a continuation of a trend to incorporate the teachings of the Yoga Sutras within a larger mission of teaching Vedanta. And it is thanks to that tradition and to these Swamis who are representatives of that tradition that yoga continues to revolutionize and influence cultures today. So thanks very much for your attention.